Namaskar. This is Dada Ranjitananda. Welcome to this webinar. Actually, it is the first class of a series of 3, and the topic is neo-humanism, liberate the intellect. This webinar is based on a book by Prabhat Ranjan Sarkar, and the name of the book is Neo-Humanism, the Liberation of Intellect. So if you want to have more details, that book is a very vast subject. There are a lot of things on that book. I will cover the basics. It means I will give you a basic idea of neo-humanism, of the philosophy, and with this you can understand better the book. But the book has more. We have only 3 hours, so it's not so much. Now, we are talking about neo-humanism. Therefore, we are talking about humans, human beings. One thing about human beings is that our mind predominates. There are many beings, inanimate, animate, underdeveloped, plants, animals, humans. Now, the difference is that in humans, the mental aspect is predominant. To understand neo-humanism, we have to understand a little bit about the mind. The mind is always moving. We are always thinking. So there is psychic movement. If in the external world everything is moving, also in our internal world, in our mental world, everything is moving. And there are different ways that the mind moves. One way, the first one that I will mention here, is sentiment. How does it work? Suppose I like something. I like it, I get attracted to it, I allow my mind to go in that direction, to run after it, and I do my action accordingly. But there is a little bit more developed way that the mind moves, and it's called discernment or conscience. How does it work? Before doing something, I think, should I do it? Should I not do it? Is it a proper thing for me to do, or it is not proper? After analyzing it, thinking about it, applying my conscience on the matter, then I take a decision and I act. That's the second way of psychic movement. The third way is instinct. Instinct is very predominant in undeveloped creatures. But in human beings, it should not be the dominating way that the mind moves. So the mind of a human being should not move according to instinct, even though there might be an influence of instinct on us, but it's only allowed to dominate undeveloped minds. Here I change a little bit the order. We have psychic movement. The most developed way of psychic movement is conscience. As you can see here, this arrow represents the development of the being. So the most developed beings, they use conscience or discernment. Less developed use sentiment. Sentiment in opposite to rationality. Rationality is more based here on conscience. and the least developed beings use instinct. In our subject, we are going to analyze the sentiments, because at present, sentiments are, let's say, predominating amongst human beings. I already mentioned that we are more psychic than physical. Animals are a little bit more physical, humans more psychic. How sentiment works? I like something. Without applying discrimination, I do it. That is a very risky path. So sentiments can bring lots of problems. And we are going to see what's happening in the human society. There are different types of sentiments that we will find in the society nowadays. And these sentiments cause different situations. The first sentiment, or the first type of sentiment, is this one, geo-sentiment. By the name geo means some geographical location. So what happens? The mind is flowing towards a territory. It means that it is dominating by the feeling for a territory. It could be my land, my place. And this kind of sentiment gave origin to many theories. For example, some theories are religious. I think that a certain place is holy. So my mind, my religious sentiment is flowing towards that location. So I create a whole theory behind it. It could be economic. I can create an economic theory to justify the idea that I want everything for my land, for my country, or for my town, for my region, all the development there, and I don't care for others. I could develop political theories, social theories. So the sentiment dominates, and I can create many theories based on that sentiment. Now, this geo-sentiment, my love, is limited to a geographical location. So you see, it's a small sentiment. My whole mind is concentrated in that small location. Here is an example of a geo-religious. As I mentioned before, I think a certain place is holy. Suppose the Ganges River. But just today, I found this article, the Ganges, holy, deadly river. Why deadly? Because it's so polluted. There is a lot of diseases there. And what the people are doing? People think that it is holy, so they will bathe on that river, but the river is very dirty. So they will get all these diseases and problems. If we think a little bit, we'll say, no, this doesn't make sense. It can also be geoeconomic. Suppose I have a country rich in a certain raw material, but an industrial country, a more developed country, buys that raw material, develops it, transforms it into some processed good, sells it, and may even sell it to that same country that sold the raw material. This gives rise to imperialism or economic fascism, and some countries remain always undeveloped, some countries developed. Geoeconomic sentiment. In this map, you can see various countries in Africa, for example, and what is their main export: coffee, grains, diamonds, gold, tea, livestock, crude oil, copper, diamonds, again, gold, coffee, iron, cotton, fish, cocoa beans, petroleum. Here, a little bit clothing and textiles, some finished product. But you see, most of these countries, they are just producing raw materials and exporting these raw materials to the industrialized countries. They are processing those materials. They are even selling back to these countries. So in this economic environment, some countries will always remain underdeveloped. So geosentiment is not only bad for the economy and also creates many conflicts, but it limits the mind. It limits the love into a very narrow radius. Therefore, it's a threat to the inner asset of humanity, which is expand this love. So where does geosentiment happen? It happens mostly where people do not follow a path of rationality. So it's a very cheap and narrow sentiment. It can happen in different spheres: social spheres, geosocialism; political, geopolitics. It can become a national socialism. What it does, confines people into a small frame of mind. They cannot think very large. Their mind is very limited. It produces violence. Now in Europe, it is happening that the political parties, the rightist political parties, are coming up. They are getting more votes. And what are sentiments that they are using? Anti-immigration, anti-euro, means the economy, about their security. So using sentiments, they are coming up. Now, how to overcome this geo-sentiment? There are two ways. One, use rationality. The other one, study, increase knowledge. If knowledge increases, people will automatically think that this geo-sentiment doesn't make sense. For example, when I was in Europe some years ago, I read an article, it came very much in the news, that all the recycled garbage, when we used to throw the garbage, we had to recycle. So it was in Germany, and what was recyclable had a green point, it was called green punct. So we had to put in a separate container, and it goes for a recycle. And the article was telling that Germany was actually exporting these materials to, as far as I remember, it was to Hungary in those days. Now, what was happening? Means you have the garbage in your place, so now you put in your neighbor. But if we think a little bit more broad, we will understand that this neighbor is not so far. And eventually, that will come to our place. It's like you throw the garbage in the neighbor, soon the smell is going to come to you and all the insects and everything. So that is a narrow way of thinking. So through study, through developing rationality, we can overcome this geo-sentiment. All right, now going to pass to another sentiment, which is a little bit more expanded. Okay, this more expanded sentiment is called social sentiment. Social means it is not related to a geographical area. it is related to a social group, means a group of people. It can go beyond geographical barriers. So a group of people can be spread all around, but still they can carry the same sentiment. So this social sentiment is more expanded. It embraces people in different geographical areas. It is a group sentiment. This social sentiment can also be social religious, social economic, social politic, but it is also people thinking about their own selfish interest. So the motivating force behind this sentiment is also some selfishness. Here, another headline: Racism and nationalism on the rise in Europe. Catholic leaders say that social sentiment is actually growing. Racism, a group of nationalism. Nationalism is more related to geographical boundary. So geo-sentiment, social sentiment. This social sentiment, it can be small, just my family. I do everything for my family, I don't care for other families. Or like in India, caste. Or it could be a community. It can go beyond that, expanding can become national sentiment. It can go even beyond, it can be international sentiment. So it can start from small and it can grow, but still the motivating force is some selfishness, is just a little bit more expanded. Now I show you here an article about the Kumbh Mela. Kumbh Mela is a very big festival in India. And they say here that the story they say is like this: the 55-day gathering is held at the confluence of the Ganges, Jamuna, and the mythic Saraswati rivers, and celebrates the victory of gods over demons in a battle for nectar that would grant them immortality. As one of the gods fled with a pitcher of the nectar, a drop is said to have spilled on the spot. So what happens? Because of that, all the people will gather on this spot and they have to bathe. And the thing is that they would have to bathe at that exactly time. But in the past, there were so many problems of conflict that they have now a system that is controlled by the police, that at at a certain time this group of people, at another time this group of people, to avoid conflict. So that's the Kumbh Mela. Now I will ask you a question. Let's ask you this question. Okay, so which sentiment? Geopolitical? No. Then social religious. And then socio-economic and geo-religious. So 67% of you think it's social-religious, and 0% think it's socio-economic, so we remove that, and 33% think it's geo-religious. So let's think if it is geo or social. We can say it might have both elements, but we could even say social, geo and social, but because it's so connected to a place, then we can say it's a little bit more geo, because it's that particular spot. Actually, the two rivers are coming together there. And they say that subterranean, there is the other river also. So there are three rivers together. And so that spot, that particular spot. And, and that's why there were conflicts because everybody has to be in that particular spot at that particular time. So it's physically impossible. So I would say it more geo-religious instead of social. Even though we can say, okay, Hindus are doing that, so it's amongst Hindus, but so that in that case only Hindus, so that is social, but all of them for that particular spot, so that makes it geo sentiment. I will ask you another question. This article here is called, the headlines is Madam CEO, get me a coffee. Basically, the article is saying that women work more, they volunteer more for different works, extra work, and their salary is less. So the question is similar to the other one, means what kind of sentiment is there? 50% think is geo-gender sentiment, 0% social-political sentiment, 50% social sentiment, and 0% geo-sentiment, 0% family sentiment. Actually, it's social sentiment. This geo-gender I just invented there to confuse you. So this doesn't exist because geo means connected to a geographical area. So we can say it's gender sentiment, but gender sentiment is a social sentiment because it's a sentiment of a group. So the dominating group in this case maybe is taking advantage of another group. So it's a gender sentiment, but it's a social sentiment. So this geo-gender doesn't exist. So this sentiment, social sentiment, is a group's sentiment. And the group could be because of social interest, because of economic interest, because of political interest, but it's always because of some interest. And this is a selfish interest. So that group has its own selfish interest, and it does things that are detrimental to others to their advantage. So that's a social sentiment. Now, the social sentiment can grow, can expand. We have the minimites, minimum, or maximites. Maximum means expand, 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 comes to a point that includes all human beings. My sentiment, first my family, my nation, then I come to a point that humanism. No, I include all humans. The question is, does humanism provide all the answers? Does it solve the problem? Does humanism solve the problem? There are two problems with humanism. It creates a clash, first, between different creatures. Intercreature means I do everything for the human being. And it's human-centered. It's the idea that we have a right over everything else. Because we can dominate everything else, then we have right over everything else. Therefore, we see our interest and we create this clash with other creatures. It could be with the plants, with the animals, with the less developed beings. When this inter-creature conflict is created, that it's a certain psychology in the mind of people, and it can easily become a conflict amongst humans, intra-creature. It means that I, as a human, may come to think that I'm more important than another human. My life has more value, and therefore I can do some experiments on this other human for the welfare of humanity. In this way, it creates a conflict also amongst humans. So the humanism, its base is also kind of selfishness. And this selfishness, when the mind gets dominated by selfishness, the selfishness can grow and grow. So this intra-human conflict means it will happen within the human species. Different situations in the world are going on. One is humanitarian help. There is a lot of humanitarian help. It could be nations helping other nations. But many times they use this humanitarian help to inject their own ideas. So I will help you if you follow this way of being. Means I give my idea, I destroy the originality of this other group of humans. And it also gives rise to two kind of strategies that we are going to see later on in the course. One is a pseudo-reformist, and another one is a pseudo-humanistic. It appears humanistic, but it's not. It appears that it's a reform, but it's not. Now, in this photo, what sentiment do you think is present in this photo? It represents. Okay, I think I got enough votes here. 0% of you think it's geosentiment. Okay, agreed. 20% think it's a socio-economic sentiment. It could be because they kill these animals because of economic reason. And it's a group of people, they are killing these animals for their own interest. We could say it's socio-economic. And the next one is social sentiment. Could be social sentiment. And 80% think it's humanism. It means that for the good of the humans, we are killing the animals. Yes. It's also, it could be that it could be a good thing, a sentiment here, in the sense that the person who is in this photo probably is not the bad person. Because if it is the person who killed the animal, would not be here having the photo taken. So therefore, maybe this guy here is concerned. One thing is that in every situation, there are a blend of different sentiments there. So no situation is black and white, that like this. Everything, there is a blend of different sentiments involved to create a certain situation. If we see the various people involved in that situation, each one is acting according to a certain sentiment. Now here another one. Obama, he made a speech, and in that speech, he said something like, people also committed terrible deeds in the name of Christ. And that became a big thing. It came on the press and everybody was talking about it. So I'm going to ask you a question about this one also. 17% think it's geo-religious, 0% that it's socio-political, 67% that it's social-religious, 0% that's socio-economic, and 17% that is humanism. Now, you see the situation. For example, first, he was mentioning the Crusades and that people did crimes. He made reference to the Crusades. The Crusades were, in a certain way, fighting for a geographical location. So there was geosentiment there. At the same time was a group of people fighting with another group of people. So at the same time, there was social sentiment there. And it was religious, social religious. But why Obama's speech became so controversial? Different people also supporting and people criticizing. Why? Maybe because of political affiliation. So there is also a little bit political there. And the last one, humanism. Well, some element of humanism, but I wouldn't say it is the main element here. But maybe could be an element in the sense that Obama was equalizing all the people, that we are all people, and because of different sentiments, we do certain things. So maybe he was uh, coming to a point where he would say, we are all humans, and because of different sentiments, we did different things. So as you see, there are always different factors. There are always different factors in the things that are happening in the world. But we always see a mixture of this geosentiment, social sentiment, and maybe a little bit of humanism. So this social sentiment can go from the minimum, the small radius, to the maximum, the larger radius. But the problem is that it is based on a certain selfishness, and that selfishness is a mental disease. The mind, what does the mind want? Mind wants expansion. Mind doesn't want barriers. Mind wants the infinite. What does selfishness do? It creates barriers. It limits the mind. So it's a disease that we need to work on and remove it. How to overcome social sentiment? Two ways. One is a certain mentality called proto-spiritualistic. What is this proto-spiritualistic mentality? It's an spiritual idea that everything is an expression of this spiritual entity. Everything, therefore, belongs to everybody. And then a principle of social equality. It means that I love my life. Another human also loves his or her life. Animals also love their life. Plants also love their life. So we are all equal. So with this principle in mind, and with this proto-spiritualistic mentality, why it's called proto-spiritualistic? Because one is not yet established in it. Means one is not yet fully with that spiritual idea, but is developing the mentality that everything is an expression of this spiritual entity. And then in this socially, all beings have same right to exist, to develop. So this principle of social equality is based on a certain idea that all beings are moving, evolving, marching together towards a certain spiritual goal. So we are all moving together in this creation, in this existence. And therefore, we as human beings, if we are the most developed beings on the planet, our duty is to care for all the other beings so that every being can move towards the spiritual goal. Because we may think, oh, only human beings, only we will achieve the spiritual goal, but every being is moving. Our mind today is a human mind, it's a developed mind, but maybe previously it was a plant mind, and then it was an animal mind until it developed to have a human body. Now comes the idea of neo-humanism. It's a sentiment that embraces all beings. It doesn't exclude any being. And it comes from that idea that we are all moving together towards this spiritual goal. Neo-humanism brings a balance in the physical and psychic existence, and it touches spiritual. It is at the threshold of spirituality. So before it becomes spiritual, needs to become neo-humanism. Means our sentiment we have to become neo-humanism before we become really spiritual. And neo-humanism will elevate humanism to universalism. It means it includes everything in the universe. It's love the universe, universal love. Not love for a geographical area, for a group, but universal love. Okay, I put another article here and I ask you another question. So this article, a Shiite militia drives back Islamic State, but divides much of Iraq. So basically, the militiamen, they are fighting the Islamic State, but the result is a division. Put the question to you here. 50% think it's a geo-religious. 33% of you think it's social-political sentiment. 17% think it's social-religious. 0% humanism, 0% neo-humanism. Okay, let's see. They are all from the Muslims, but one is from one, let's say, sector of Muslim, and the other is another one. So, and many of you think it's geo. I would say it's more social, and I would even say it's more social religious. Of course, yes, it's also political because one wants to have the political dominance, but they are kind of separated by their religion. So as you see, there are elements of all the various sentiments are here. But I wouldn't put the majority of it as a geo sentiment here, because geo would be related to that the sentiment is born out of geographical area. Of course, they want to dominate that geographical area, but the more they want their group to dominate it. So I would say it's more a social sentiment than a geo sentiment, in spite of having a geo sentiment element. Okay. So what are the obstacles for neo-humanism? Dogmas. Dogmas are limited ideas, ism, nationalism, and all these isms, and selfishness. So these are the obstacles for neo-humanism. Dogma has created a lot of wars. People are fighting because of a certain dogma, religious dogma, but there is also economic dogma. There is limited ideas in the field of economics that are not justifiable. Some of economic theories that we have that are dominating nowadays are based on certain dogmas. So it's not only religious. So how to get established in neo-humanism? Expand the love. Love has to be expanded in all directions to include everything. And the source of inspiration of neo-humanism has to be spiritual. Because if it's not spiritual, it's limited. If it's limited, it remains selfishness. Selfishness is a germ in the mind, and it goes on eating more and more. All right, that was the presentation for today. As a summary, I talked about the different types of psychic movement. I started with sentiment, then I talked about discernment or discrimination, and about instinct. And I reordered them, like discernment or discrimination was the most developed, the second is sentiment, and the third is instinct. I talked about geosentiment. It could be religious, economic, political, how to overcome it, study, and rationality. Then I talk about social sentiment, which can also be religious, economic, political, etc. How to overcome it, principle of social equality, and proto-spiritualistic mentality. And then the maximum of social sentiment, expand, became humanism. Problem with humanism, also based on a certain selfishness. And finally, neo-humanism, it based on spirituality. So that was it. If you have any questions. Okay, there is a question here. How can study overcome geosentiment? Well, the thing is that most of the geosentiment, it comes out of a limitation of the mind to understand something. So as people start understanding it, as they study, their knowledge increases. When knowledge increases, the mind expands. So when the mind expands, it cannot anymore accept a limited sentiment. So it wants to embrace something larger. So that's why study will help to overcome this geosentiment. So education, the more education we have in the world, more people get educated, increase their knowledge. Now, for example, with internet and the spread of knowledge, communication, television, people are coming to know more things. Therefore, for example, if people are thinking a certain, for example, in the case of if the river is holy, so I go there, I take a bath, so all my sins go away. Now, if we analyze the data, for example, all the people who went there, all the disease they got, all the problem, then they start understanding that it doesn't make sense. And if it doesn't make sense, they will not follow it anymore. Thank you very much for participating. Good night. Namaskar.